Thanks for stopping by. I did not know that. Please like and subscribe.
Please stop saying don't forget to like and subscribe.
Sure, but how are we going to get followers?
Welcome to a unique episode of I Did Not Know That. This story is one you won't find anywhere else. A few weeks ago, I stumbled upon a Norman Rockwell painting titled Second Holiday. As a longtime admirer of Rockwell's work, I was intrigued. What really caught my attention was a note stating that a touching story with the same name accompanied this painting. Despite my extensive search, I couldn't find the story online anywhere. Determined, I finally tracked down a 1939 magazine on eBay that featured the story. I then turned it into an audio story for you to enjoy, so sit back, relax, and let yourself be transported back to 1939 with Second Holiday.
Doc Peters knew part of it, and afterward he told what he knew, but he didn't know all. What he did know and tell was about that midsummer afternoon when he was summoned, as he had occasionally been summoned before to see Mrs. Yeamans. She said she didn't feel exactly sick, Mr. Yeamans told him over the telephone, but she had that little pain in her side again, and so they thought that Doc might as well come over. So he did come over and found her lying in bed, a tiny gray-haired woman wearing a decorously high-necked nightgown. Doc boomed out his customary, well, what have we here? And then he closed the door, leaving Mr. Yeamans to pace nervously in the hall outside. Mr. Yeamans paced up and down, staring solemnly at his shoes, and finally, after what seemed to him to be a very long time, Doc opened the door and called him in. Doc's voice still boomed, his eyes still twinkled with their usual twinkle. Things looked all right. "Frank," said Doc, "I've just been telling Essie that I think it'd be a good idea for you to take her up to Rochester for a spell. You know, just to let her have a going over by the smart boys up there." At the name Rochester, Mr. Yeamans's pale face, he'd been courthouse reporter for as long as anyone remember and didn't get much sun, turned a shade paler. But when he glanced at his wife and at Doc, he saw that they were smiling reassuringly, so he felt better. "I told you it wasn't anything serious, Frank," said Mrs. Yeamans. "Just that same old pain. So don't go worrying." Instead of worrying, Mr. Yeamans sat down and he and the Doc and Essie visited almost the whole afternoon. The three of them had lived in Lathana all their lives, and what with Mr. Yeamans being the courthouse reporter and Doc being the doctor, there wasn't much they didn't know about what went on in town. They had a good gossip, with Doc's laugh shaking the china ornaments on the dresser, and with Mr. Yeamans slapping his thigh, and with Mrs. Yeamans's voice, faint from merriment, sighing, "You two will be the death of me, I swear you will, making me laugh so much that my insides are turning every which way." Then Doc rose to go, and Mr. Yeamans accompanied him downstairs to let him out. When he came back, he found that Essie had got up from bed and was dressing. "I don't feel sick, and I don't look sick, and I'm not sick," she said. "I'm going to get your supper." "Essie," said Mr. Yeamans, and his eyes were worried. "About this Rochester business. I knew you'd be upset when he said that," said Mrs. Yeamans. She was sitting before the mirror, putting her amber combs in her hair, and she was humming softly. But now she stopped humming and looked around almost as if she were afraid of eavesdroppers. Her voice was low and confidential. "I don't have to go, Frank," she said. "We all know that you and Doc and me. But," and there was a suspicion of a giggle in her throat, "but, as I told Doc, I want to go. You and I haven't been away on a real trip since we went to the fair in Chicago." By this Mrs. Yeamans meant not the Century of Progress, but the Exposition of 1893. She lifted her head defiantly. "So I've been thinking, why shouldn't we make this an excuse?" Mr. Yeamans grinned a conspirator's grin. "Funny," he said. "That's just the way it strikes me, too." Then his eyes took on that worried look again, not so worried as before, but worried. The only thing is the money. We'll write to Bert, said Mrs. Yeamans. May won't like it, of course, but if we write and tell them it's serious and that I have to go, I guess she can't keep him from sending us whatever we need. She paused, a little ashamed of her skill in duplicity. In a way, I hate to do it, she said, but if he thought we wanted it just for a trip, well, he just probably wouldn't give it to us, that's all. You know how close he is sometimes. She shook her head. I declare, she said, I never thought the day would come when I'd play a trick like that on our own Bert. Rats, said Mr. Yeamans cheerfully. What Bert doesn't know won't hurt him. He twiddled his thumbs and gazed reflectively at the hard maple in the small side yard. Rochester, he said in an awed tone. Just like we were Mr. and Mrs. Chauncey up at the State Bank. He chuckled. Next thing we know, it'll be winters in Florida. Now, Frank, you stop, said Mrs. Yeamans, though she couldn't help, laughing too. It's bad enough our doing it at all without your gloating about it. So that night, Mr. Yeamans wrote Bert a long, pious letter, a letter which Mrs. Yeamans half-laughingly and half-shamefacedly admitted was a masterpiece of its kind, and several days later Bert sent them the money. He also sent them 3 pages of advice as to how to make it last as long as possible. I bet May told him to put all that in, said Mr. Yeamans, blithely tearing the pages into small pieces. Then his lips tightened. The way they talk, you'd think we'd never been away from home before. But his annoyance passed quickly, for by this time both he and Mrs. Yeamans were hardened criminals, or at least hardened hypocrites. They told each other that they felt equal to doing things now that they had never dared to do before. There was a week of frenzied preparation for the journey. Mrs. Yeamans, sitting at the sewing machine fixing up her clothes, calling on Mr. Yeamans to help drag the old steamer trunk out of the basement, pattering briskly around the house with, as she said, 101 things on my mind. Mr. Yeamans, meanwhile, was doing some pattering on his own account, too. Downtown, for instance, where he dropped in at various centers of information, the post office, Al's barber shop, the Universal Drug Store, to spread casually the news that he was going to take Essie for a little run up to Rochester. You know how it is with the women. They like to get away now and then. And to his associates at the courthouse he said nonchalantly, Essie and I are taking a trip. We've been mulling it over and now looks like as good a time as any. We thought some of going to Yellowstone, but instead I guess we'll go to Rochester. Obviously, but not too obviously, people were impressed, and at home the Yeamans congratulated themselves on the wisdom of their choice. Before, they'd never had anything to boast about in the way of travel, unless it was the fair in '93, and people got tired hearing about that. In fact, sometimes they, themselves, had got tired thinking about it, having thought about it for 45 years. But their friends were always going away, to the Black Hills, to the Dells, to Chicago, and even California. And now they were going, and to Rochester. It took money to go to Rochester. Everyone knew that. So in a way, it was even better than going to the Black Hills. As Mr. Yeamans expressed it, any ragtag and bobtail can go to the Black Hills if they got a car and money for gas. The Yeamans, as it happened, had no car and never did have one. Sometimes Mr. Yeamans had felt a little frustrated about that, but not now, not anymore. I could write a letter home to the Banner, said Mr. Yeamans. You know, like Sam Hargreaves did when he went to Washington, D.C. He began to extemporize, Dear Banner friends, Mrs. Yeamans and your correspondent arrived in the city of Rochester, Minn. at 9:03 a.m. on Tuesday, August. The less you say, the better, advised Mrs. Yeamans. The enormity of their deceit seemed to be dawning on her. The less both of us say, the better. So off they went. They went by train in a streamlined day coach whose seats lay back so far that you could almost imagine that you were sleeping in a bed. The coach was air-conditioned, too, which was nice while they were en route, even though it did leave them unprepared for the blast of heat which swept up at them when they descended at Rochester. Their faces already moist, they stood in the sultriness of the station platform trying to protect their common valise from the fast-talking hotel porters who swarmed around them. A small, bony woman in muslin, and a slightly taller man wearing a black suit, black high-topped shoes, and a white stiff collar with a black string tie. Mr. Yeamans pressed Mrs. Yeamans's arm. It might have been to comfort her, it might have been to reassure himself. "Well, sir," he said, "here we are, right in Rochester." "Yes, sir," said Essie, "here we are." They stayed at a regular hotel. Mrs. Yeamans said that a boarding house would be better, that is, cheaper, but Mr. Yeamans objected. They didn't take many trips, he told her, and when they did, they'd live in style. So they went first to the Karma, because it was near the clinic, but they came away from it very quickly on being informed that a room there would cost them $5–6 a day. "We may look green," Mr. Yeamans told the clerk with quiet dignity, "but I guess we're not that green." Eventually, they installed themselves in a nice room at the Deluxe. The Deluxe had no big, flashy lobby with a lot of four-flushers lolling around because it was located above a store, but it was homey once you climbed the palm-lined stairway leading to it, and they had a wash bowl right in their own room and a bathroom just down the hall, and so they felt that the $250 they were paying was well spent. Also, downstairs on the street, that is, in front of the Crashel Hardware Company, which occupied the ground floor, there were several benches where they could sit and watch the passers-by. The first thing they did was to register Mrs. Yeamans at the clinic, a somewhat complicated process where she was given a tan envelope containing other little envelopes telling her on what floor to be at what time and which doctor to ask for when she got there. The doctors, when she finally managed to see them, were all very nice, and most of them were surprisingly young. They probably didn't know any more than Doc Peters back in Lathana, but they looked more, well, polished. Yes, that was the word. Polished. She didn't get in to see any of them right away, of course. The envelopes might say 11 o'clock or 11:30, but they soon discovered that they had to wait. Not that they minded waiting. "Of course, if I was really sick," Mrs. Yeamans said, "it would be different. But as it is, it's kind of nice just to sit here and look at the people." So that's what they did, in the various big waiting halls on the various floors. It was like sitting in a big city depot, Mr. Yeamans said, except that the chairs were a lot more comfortable. And the people you saw, all kinds of people, mostly elderly couples like themselves, but a sprinkling of young folks too. The young ones looked more scared than the others for some reason. "Probably," Mrs. Yeamans pointed out, "because they have more to lose." She herself wasn't scared, she said. "After all, why should she be?" "Guilty is the word for what I feel," she confided to Mr. Yeamans. "I really don't have any right to be here, Frank, but I'm glad I am. It's all so interesting." The whole town was interesting, they thought. There was the museum, for instance, where you could see wax casts of operations and a glass skeleton that lighted up with electricity and photographs of folks who had been in automobile accidents and how they looked after the doctors had fixed them up. And then there was the general bustle of the place. Walking to the clinic each morning, Mr. Yeamans made a habit of counting the different state licenses on the cars. One day he counted 29, including one from Hawaii. That showed, he said, how cosmopolitan the town was. Another day they bought a souvenir pillow cover pink fringed satin with a lovely painting of the clinic on it and a poem beneath. "Here the sky is blue and here the trees are green. Rochester's a place that really must be seen. When your heart is sad and your thoughts are blue, just remember what old Rochester has done for you." Mrs. Yeamans said she would send it to May, Bert's wife, because we certainly owe them something for having made all this possible. Mr. Yeamans didn't think May deserved it, and he said she ought to be satisfied with a postcard. They were sending out quite a lot of postcards those first few days, to practically everybody in Lethena, in fact. Later, they realized that at the rate they were going, they soon wouldn't have anyone left to send them to. So after that, they cut down to 3 or 4 a day. At the hotel and during the long periods of waiting in the clinic rooms, they formed several interesting acquaintanceships. Mr. and Mrs. Kelsey of Enid, Oklahoma, Reverend Mr. and Mrs. Pattison of Kansas City, Mr. and Mrs. Norton of Los Gatos, California, Mrs. Beebe of 2435 Sheldon Road, Evanston, Illinois. Mr. Yeamans took down all the addresses in a little black notebook, and Mr. Pardee of Marshalltown, Iowa. Mr. Pardee turned out to be their special friend. They happened to sit next to him on one of the clinic couches, and he looked so downcast that they couldn't help speaking to him and trying to cheer him up. And it was a good thing they did because he needed cheering up. He wasn't sick himself. He explained that he came into the clinic only because he knew he could find a place to sit down and maybe somebody to talk to, but his wife was. He'd brought her up to be examined, and they'd put her in a hospital, and now he had nobody to talk to. He soon did have, though. They saw to that. Every evening they ate with him in the cafeteria, which was their favorite dining place, and usually he would come back to the hotel with them for a chat. Or sometimes would stop in at Weber and Judd's for sodas, Mr. Yeamans paying one time and Mr. Pardee the next time. Occasionally they would have their chat on one of the benches in the park surrounding the museum. It was nice sitting there in the evening and listening to the carillon chimes floating out from the clinic tower. It was wonderful the things the man played on the carillon, regular tunes. They felt mighty sorry for Mr. Pardee, because it was clear that he hadn't much hope for his wife's recovery. They think it's her heart, he told them. He never actually said what they thought was wrong with her heart, just they think it's her heart. Then Mr. and Mrs. Yeamans would exchange secret, pitying glances and try to change the conversation. When I hear him talk like that about his wife, Mrs. Yeamans sometimes said afterward, I feel ashamed, really I do. I mean, look at the time he's having here and look at the time we're having. It just don't seem fair. We're entitled to it, Essie, Mr. Yeamans comforted her. After all, it's time we had a trip. And can we help it if other folks are here for other reasons? Sometimes Mr. Pardee would politely diverge from what were his own troubles to what he thought were theirs. How you folks coming along, he would say. What's the diagnosis on Mrs. Yeamans? And then both of them would give embarrassed little laughs, and Mrs. Yeamans would say, well, we haven't got any diagnosis yet exactly. And Mr. Yeamans would say, she had a bad spell last night for a while, but it passed off. It was as if he wanted to convince Mr. Pardee that they had no bed of roses either. As a matter of fact, though, Mrs. Yeamans did have some spells, one quite bad one, worse than she'd ever had. Mr. Yeamans woke in the night to hear her breathing hard and to feel the drawing of the sheet as they clenched it between her fingers. What's the matter, Essie? He said. Oh, she said, and she sounded exasperated rather than sick. It's my side again. It was those strawberries, I guess. I should have known better, she said. But in the morning she felt perfectly fine. Fine, but conscience-stricken. You know, she said, it served me right if I did get really sick. Probably be just what I deserve for coming up here under false pretenses. At first both had expressed a slight fear that the doctors might eventually expose Mrs. Yeamans for the fraud she was. It was triumph for them, therefore, when at the end of the week the clinic people were so thoroughly fooled that they requested that Mrs. Yeamans go to a hospital for observation. It was Mr. Yeamans who transmitted the request to his wife, transmitted it somewhat timidly and reluctantly, as he confessed to her later, because he was afraid that she might think this was carrying a good thing too far. After all, he told her, Playing sick when you were allowed to do everything you wanted was one matter, and playing sick in a hospital bed was another, but she didn't offer any objection at all. "Of course I'll go," she said, as if Justice No were at last catching up with her. "Those who dance must pay the piper." Mr. Yeamans nodded. "I guess that's about the size of it," he said. "We've got Thingham thinking that you're really sick, and so it's just up to you to pretend that you are, just so as to make the trip seem on the square." "Those doctors," said Mrs. Yeamans, and giggled. "They think they're so smart. They'd feel pretty cheap if they knew the way we've tricked them, wouldn't they?" Mr. Yeamans smilingly rubbed his chin. "They certainly would," he said. "They would for a fact." And so Mrs. Yeamans went to the hospital. The hospital wasn't quite so much fun because the visiting hours were strict and Mr. Yeamans couldn't see her very often. But when he did come to see her, he had lots to tell about who had checked out of the deluxe and who had arrived and what he had for dinner. Also about the Pardees. Mrs. Pardee, it seemed, was better. In fact, she was well and always had been. What she had believed to be heart trouble had proved to be not heart trouble at all, and the doctors had told her, politely of course, to go home and forget about it. So she and Mr. Pardee had left. "She was kind of mad, I guess," said Mr. Yeamans, smiling reminiscently. "She'd made up her mind to be sick, and when they told her she wasn't, she didn't like it." Mrs. Yeamans looked thoughtful. "I suppose you'll be wanting to go home pretty soon too, won't you, Frank?" she said. "Not me," he said. "No, sir, I'm having a good time here. Of course it's hard on you being cooped up in bed like this, but—" "Oh, I'm all right," said Mrs. Yeamans. "Nothing to do but lie here and wait for my meals. I certainly can't complain." She laid her hand on his. "It's turned out to be just as nice as we thought it was going to be, hasn't it?" she said. "Better," said Mr. Yeamans. And right after that he left, somewhat abruptly, and Mrs. Yeamans lay back in the darkness and smiled up at the ceiling. She didn't sleep very well at the hospital. It wasn't due to the fact that the bed was strange, because she had slept well enough at the deluxe. It was because she slept alone, and she hadn't done that. No, not even for one night, for 47 years. That was on a Tuesday, and on Friday morning Mr. Yeamans came in earlier than usual, at 8 o'clock in fact, before visitors were supposed to be permitted. "Well," he said, "I hear they're going to operate on you. Now they have got you." Mrs. Yeamans smiled a little sheepishly. "Isn't it crazy?" she said. "I mean, when there's nothing wrong with me. But," and she shrugged, "I guess it won't hurt much." "If Bert and May do suspect anything," said Mr. Yeamans, "this certainly ought to put 'em off the track. They won't have any kick about the trip now. No, sir." "Maybe we shouldn't have started all this," said Mrs. Yeamans. And then she sighed, though not uncheerfully. "But it's too late to think about that now." Mr. Yeamans moved closer to the bed. "You aren't scared, are you, Essie?" he said. "Me scared?" she said. "Land! No." She paused. "Matter of fact, it's probably a good idea. I do have those little pains, you know, and maybe this'll put a stop to them. No telling what they'll find in there." "They won't find a thing," said Mr. Yeamans with a sudden sharpness. "Not one thing. You know that, don't you, Essie?" "Oh, of course I do," she said. "Now, don't get yourself all upset, Frank." Mr. Yeamans sat by her bedside for quite a while. Some of the time they talked, but toward the last their stock of conversation seemed to run out, and so they were silent, with Mr. Yeamans's hand lying casually on the bed where Mrs. Yeamans could reach out for it if she wanted to. But she didn't reach out until he rose to leave. "You go to the movies or something, Frank," she said. "I'll be all right." "Sure, you'll be all right," he said. "I'll just go over to the park and sit and watch the people. Funny, I never get tired watching the people here. Always somebody different." He sighed. "It'll seem mighty dull when we get back to Lathana where we've seen everybody before." He moved toward the door and then hesitated. His voice was unnaturally bright and gay. "Got a good mind to give you a kiss, Essie," he said. They rarely kissed each other anymore, except on occasions like birthdays and Christmas morning and their anniversary. You know, for luck. He tiptoed back toward the bed as if she were asleep and kissed her. After that, he went out without looking back. Doc Peters didn't know about any of that, but just as he knew about the beginning, because he was there when it happened, so he knew about the end, because the doctors in Rochester wrote him. They said they couldn't understand it. All that business of the two of them keeping secrets from each other, and they wanted to know if he could, but he couldn't. That is, he could understand what Mr. and Mrs. Yeamans did, but he couldn't understand why they did it. And probably nobody ever will understand it completely either, except the two of them. Right up to the very last, Doc said. She didn't want him to know the truth, and he didn't want her to know it. But they both did know, of course, from the start. Each of them realized what that little pain was, but they just wouldn't admit it to the other one. That afternoon, when I went over to the house to see her and told her what her trouble was, she says to me, "You mustn't ever tell Frank, Doc. Not till it's all over. I'll pretend I want to go away just on account of a trip." And when he saw me to the door, and I told him what the matter was, after all, I had to, he said the same thing. "Now, don't let on to her what it is, Doc. If she's going to die, there's no reason for her to know it in advance. You keep her unsuspecting, the way she is now, and I'll keep her that way too." Doc sighed. A fool's paradise. That's what each of them wanted for the other. A lot of people in town thought it was kind of silly. All that nonsense about a trip and all, they said. What good did that do? Wouldn't it have been better if they'd faced the truth together? So maybe it would have been better. The end would have been the same in any case, of course, but maybe the approach to it would have been easier. And maybe not too, because the way it was, the way each had planned it, both of them believed that they were bearing the burden alone and were saving the other the knowledge of what lay ahead. And somehow, that seemed to make the burden lighter.
I couldn't uncover if this story is based on true events or if Rockwell painted this piece after he was inspired by the story, or if the writer, Richard Sherman, penned the tale after seeing Rockwell's painting. If you have any info or insights on this, please share them in the comments below. Hey, thanks for joining me, and I hope you enjoyed this special episode.
Better